The podcast begins by discussing the current political landscape following Kamala Harris becoming the Democratic nominee for president. Ben Shapiro suggests that Democrats are experiencing a sugar high due to Joe Biden no longer being the nominee, but warns that they may be mistaking this for Harris being a good and effective candidate. Recent polls show the race has tightened, with Harris within the margin of error nationally against Donald Trump. However, Shapiro argues this is mainly because Harris is not a dead person like Biden, rather than her being a strong candidate. The podcast notes that Democratic enthusiasm problems have largely disappeared, as many were unenthusiastic about Biden. However, Shapiro characterizes the current Democratic enthusiasm as having a manic property to it. Despite the media's positive coverage of Harris, she is still not leading in key swing state polls. Shapiro predicts Harris will get about 3 weeks of positive coverage before her bump wears off. A significant portion of the podcast is devoted to discussing Kamala Harris's candidacy and what Shapiro perceives as her weirdness. Shapiro argues that Harris has two main problems as a candidate. One, she's very radical on policy and believes weird things. And two, she's a weird person in terms of her personal affect and mannerisms. Shapiro plays clips of Harris discussing equity in what he characterizes as a Marxist way, and notes her support for policies like banning fracking and gun seizures. He also points to her personal quirks, such as her laugh and tendency to deliver word salads in speeches. The podcast suggests that Democrats are trying to reframe Harris's weirdness as a positive trait, similar to how they attempted to rebrand Joe Biden as Dark Brandon. Shapiro argues this is a deliberate strategy to deflect attention from Harris's perceived oddities. The podcast then shifts to discussing JD Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee. Shapiro argues that Democrats are attempting to label Vance as weird in order to counter the narrative about Harris. He plays clips of Democratic figures like Chuck Schumer and Jen Psaki calling Vance weird and erratic. Shapiro defends Vance, arguing that he is actually one of the most normal people to ever be a vice presidential candidate. He suggests that Democrats are focusing on comments Vance made about childless cat ladies in 2021 to paint him as strange, but argues this is a mischaracterization of Vance's actual views on family and society. The podcast then pivots to discussing broader cultural issues, using the recent Olympics opening ceremony in Paris as an example. Shapiro criticizes a segment of the ceremony that featured a queer and trans-inspired version of the Last Supper, calling it a deliberate insult to Christians worldwide. This leads to a discussion of what Shapiro sees as the Weird West, where traditional values are mocked and alternative lifestyles are celebrated. He argues that this cultural shift is connected to declining birth rates and religious practice in countries like France, warning of potential demographic and social consequences. Returning to the topic of Kamala Harris, the podcast discusses her campaign strategy, which Shapiro characterizes as divisive and based on intersectionality. He mentions a series of Zoom calls organized by the Harris campaign for specific demographic groups, such as white women for Kamala and black, gay, and queer men for Harris. Shapiro argues that this approach of dividing the electorate into specific identity groups is a continuation of Barack Obama's 2012 campaign strategy, rather than his more unifying 2008 approach. He suggests this strategy is potentially alienating to some voters. The podcast then delves into specific criticisms of Kamala Harris, focusing on her perceived dishonesty and involvement in covering up Joe Biden's health issues. Shapiro cites a poll showing that 92% of Americans believe Harris was involved in covering up Biden's health to some degree. He also discusses reports that Barack Obama was involved in pressuring Biden to drop out of the race, potentially using the threat of the 25th Amendment. He argues that Harris and other Democratic leaders were complicit in covering up Biden's decline. The podcast concludes with a discussion of foreign policy, particularly focusing on recent events involving Israel and the terrorist group Hezbollah. Shapiro criticizes the Biden administration's approach to the Middle East, arguing that it has emboldened groups like Hezbollah to attack Israel. He plays a clip of Donald Trump criticizing the administration's handling of the situation and agrees with Trump's assessment that such attacks wouldn't have happened under his presidency. Shapiro also criticizes Turkey's stance towards Israel and questions why Turkey remains a member of NATO, given its support for groups like Hamas. The podcast criticizes mainstream media coverage of recent attacks on Israel, arguing that outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post are presenting biased narratives that downplay the role of terrorist groups and unfairly portray Israel as an aggressor. Shapiro also takes issue with some Democratic politicians' stances on Israel, particularly criticizing those who boycotted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress. He agrees with Trump's statement that Jewish voters who support Democrats should have their head examined, arguing that the Democratic Party's policies and attitudes are harmful to Israel and Jewish interests.